Okay, so we are diving deeper into plant requirements and the plant required cultural conditions. And of course, light, water, nutrients. We've gone through nutrients, temperature so far. We are diving into soil now. So first off, what is soil? Google it. You're going to get dictionary definition as the upper layer of earth in which plants grow. A black or dark brown material, typically consisting of a mixture of organic remains, clay, and rock particles. So we've got a mixture of sand, silt, clay, that's the clay and rock particles, and some organic material. So if you look at the different sizes here, okay, gravel, of course, is large. It's considered more of an aggregate than a portion of the soil. The mixture of sand, silt, clay, relative. Okay, so this gives you a relative size idea of what's actually in the soil. We've got sand at this size, silt where you can actually see it, and then clay where it's actually invisible at that scale. Okay, so the particle size themselves. So again, to give you an idea of the difference in the particle sizes, sand, silt, and then clay if we blow it way up. Now, generally, there are some oddball soils or manufactured soils, but the reality of soils is that the sand, silt, and clay are all of the same parent mineral. Okay, it's all essentially the same material or the same composition. It's the same exact makeup between the sand, silt, and clay. The only difference is in the particle size. And as we'll see later in this presentation, the sizes have different characteristics. So with that Google dictionary portion, really this portion right here is considered soil, okay? The portion of the soil of Earth's crust that supports plants. It does dive deeper a little bit because here you can see this is probably perennials and monocot. So remember, they have shallower root systems and typically fibrous root systems that are shallower. The dicots can dive a little bit deeper, but really it's this darker brown area within the soil profile or the profile of the earth that is the soil, okay? And it is a combination of sand, silt, and clay and organic matter. It's primarily the organic matter and carbon percentage in here that gives it the darker color. Now, when we look at what is in the soil, we already talked about the mineral particles and the organic matter. What else is in that soil should be air and water. And you can see that it is a 50-50 split between the solid portions of the soil, mineral particles and organic matter. These are solid materials. And then the other 50% is air, gas, and water, liquid. Okay, so if we look at this, this looks like all solid material, but there's porosity within it, which is really, really, really important for supporting plant life. Plants need water and air in the soil. And in the absence of either, we get some conditions that aren't conducive to root development and root thriving and surviving. So if we dive a little bit into, we already talked about the mineral particles. We also want to look at that organic matter content. Okay, so a total of 5% is organic matter of the total soil profile. So of that 5% organic matter, we've talked about humus before. 80 approximately, right? Nothing's perfect, but these are the approximate proportions. 80% of that is humus, 10% roots, 10% organisms. Okay, so if we jump back into this and we look at this section right here of soil, then approximately 50% of that should be relatively even split, and that varies between water and air. Okay, immediately after a rain event, there's a lot more water in it, but then that drains out, and then you get that approximately 50-50 portion of air and water. And then the other 50% are the solids, being 90% of that, 50% would be the sand, silt, clay, the minerals, and then the other 5%, or sorry, 10% of that full 50, if we consider that 100, would be the organic matter, and that is split between humus, roots, and organisms. So that mineral content, the mineral content of, again, the mineral particles, and those mineral particles being some sort of composition of sand, silt, and clay, the three different size particles. The mineral content drives some of the inherent characteristics of that soil. Okay, so that being said, the percent clay, percent silt, and percent sand really helps us define what type of soil it is. And these are the typical soil types. 100% sand plus or minus is a sandy soil. Same with silty. And then if there's relatively high clay content, then we get a clay soil. Any combination, for the most part, any combination of the three of reasonably like large or reasonable portions of the sand, silt, or clay, any combination of that, we get some sort of loam soil. So you can see that we have a silt loam here, and that's a combination of sand, silt, and clay. Here, clay loam, a straight up loam, sandy loam, sandy clay loam, loamy sand, silty clay loam, etc. Okay, so it defines some inherent characteristics of the soil itself, and we'll get into what those characteristics are. So the way that this is actually done is there's some sort of analysis of the soil that is done. That could be a simple jar test, which is in the technical world, and if you take a soils class, then you're going to learn about soil textural class through sedimentation. And the reality of that is it's a jar test, so a soil jar test. And we can pop one up here. Here we go. Yep, so perfect example right here. I'll just zip it over into here. This is a soils test, right? This is, and essentially what happens is you, this can be done in the lab, but they do it similarly, but under some pretty controlled conditions. But you essentially take a sample of the soil, you put it in a jar, and you shake it up, and you shake the heck out of it to break up all the different particles. If they're, well, we can, if there's some really tough, like connected particles, and you can't get them to release through agitation, through shaking it up, then you can add a surfactant, which is really like, we put this in layman's terms, which is my preference. It's really a little bit of like dish soap, a little teeny drop of dish soap, and essentially that just breaks things apart. So you allow it to sit for 24 hours, and usually within the first 10 to 15 minutes or sooner, all of the sand has settled out. Okay, because it's larger particles, they're heavier, they will settle quickly. Within the next hour, 2-3 hours, the silt will settle out. And then within the next, the remainder of that 24 hours, for the most part, the clay should settle out, but you can see there's still some suspended in here. Okay, so if we took this to determine what type of soil this is, we've got 45% sand, 35% silt, and 20% clay. And the way that you do this is you literally just hold up a tape measure to the side of this, and you see that you've got 4 inches of sedimented soil, and you just measure how much each one is, do some math, and you figure out the percentage. So if we zip this off to the side, the way that this is actually done is, if we start with the sand, percent sand, and we start at 45% sand, I'm going to find the 45% mark, and I'm going to draw a line towards the percent clay. Okay, my next line is going to be, I'll use blue for percent clay. I've got 20% clay, so here's my 20% mark. And then my 35% silt, let me see, I'll use yellow for that. 35% silt. And where that crosses, where those 3 lines cross, is right there. That's a loam soil. Okay, so really easy to figure this out, practically free. Although, let me pop this open. I actually just received a, there we go. To clear all drawings. There we go. So this is a recent soils analysis that I got. It gives me a lot of information on how to, amend the soil for certain types of plantings. But let's dive into, they have given us the maintenance. Here's what I want. So it's got very low organic percentage, and I am looking for, there it is. So this one is a clay loam, and it was 40% clay, 20% silt, and the remainder is sand. So we've got 35, 36, 37, 38, about 40-ish% of sand. So here, let's say that this is 40%, 20%, and 40%. And by the way, this soils analysis, I use Waypoint Analytical. This soils analysis cost, I think, $208 and took a week and a half to receive. So we mailed the soil sample off to Waypoint a week and a half ago, and we received this a week and a half later. Generally, it's a week turnaround, and it's a $208 fee right now. That fee goes up over time with rising costs, etc. So, oops, open the wrong piece here. Let's do this. And so if we were at 40% sand and 40% clay and 20% silt, we are like, that tells us yes, we are in clay loam. And reality of it is probably pushed us into clay loam because it was only like 39 point whatever of percentage of clay and a little bit higher percentage of sand, right? So a little less than 40% on the clay, a little bit more than 40% on the sand, and that puts us right down in here. So again, that being said, it's a clay loam, but it's really close to a clay soil. So we'll find out what that means. Okay, but this is the soil textural class triangle, and it's a really, really handy, it's really handy information to actually have, and it's easy to figure out. Okay, back to this. There we go. Okay, so important to understand that you can't change soil texture, but you can affect soil structure. You cannot change soil texture. So that soil textural class, right, that project that I just showed is a clay loam, okay? We can't change that. You know, you might think, well, could we add a bunch of sand to that and make it more of a clay loam or drop it into a sandy clay loam? Well, I guess anything is possible, but realistically and practically, it's actually impossible to do it, okay? Like, you can't actually do it unless you completely import soils. So we need to understand what characteristics a clay loam has or a clay soil has in order to understand what types of plants work well in them, what plants will not work well, etc. Okay, so looking at the different particle sizes, sand, silt, and clay. The sand is made up of larger particles and it feels gritty to the touch. Okay, so if you pick up some soil and you run it between your thumb and your forefinger, your pointer finger, you're gonna feel some grit to it. Remember, we can see sand, we can't necessarily see a silt or a clay particle. So you're gonna feel a grittiness to that. The silt isn't going to feel gritty at all, but if it's dry, it's going to feel very flour-like. Okay, it's going to feel like flour. And then the clay, same thing. If clay is broken up and you run it between your fingers, it's going to feel the same as silt if it's wet. The difference comes in from like an infield analysis. The difference comes in if you pick up a wet chunk of soil and you start running it through your fingers, you're going to feel the sand again. You feel the grittiness. You can probably see it as well. The silt, on the other hand, you're going to feel velvety. Okay, when it's wet, you're going to feel that it's velvety between your fingers. Clay feels similar, but when you pull your fingers apart, if there's a higher clay content, it's going to feel sticky. If there's a really low clay content, but it feels very, very velvety, then you pull your fingers apart, there's going to be very little stick to it. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what these different soil particle sizes feel like in the field. So clay, sand, silt, and I always feel like this picture is a little bit of like, you know, yay, loam, right? Technically, a loamy soil is just a reasonable combination of sand, silt, and clay. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's like a dark brown, but typically in loamy soils, you do find that they're a little bit more richer, dark brown in appearance because plants really like to grow in loamy soil. Like most plants thrive in loamy soil. So looking at the characteristics of each one of the types of soils. So a clay soil generally is considered a heavy soil. It's very compact in nature. Because the particles are so small, they will pack together very tightly. This results in plants having a much harder time developing roots in that type of soil. And clay soil tends to retain tons of water, okay? And there's reasons for that. We'll go into that. But it's not always desirable. It's not always in a desirable way. You want soils to be able to hold water. Plants need water, right? Those roots need water. That plant needs water in order to respire and transpire. We already went through all that. But in a heavy clay soil, so a high clay content soil, yes, you can get a lot of water in it, but generally it holds within it really tightly and will not flow through. There's drainage issues in clay soils. And when they do get a lot of water, it'll settle those clay particles out and it will compact them more and more and more. So clay soils are challenging soils for plants to grow into because they're heavy, typically compact, and while they're able to hold a lot of water, it's usually not in a desirable way. Now, how do we fix that? Remember, we cannot change our soil texture. So if we have a clay soil or a clay loam to clay soil, what do we do? Well, the nice thing is adding additional organic matter is a huge benefit. Okay. And it's technically, I guess it's almost impossible to add too much organic matter to it. What the organic matter does is it adds porosity into that soil. There's a lot of pore space within clay soils, but generally it's such tiny pores that as you add more organic matter, it's adding additional pore space to it and allowing that soil to be more airy, to have more air in it. And remember, we want, in an ideal world, an even split between air and water. But clay soils have a tendency to have a higher water content until there's not enough water. And then all of a sudden, there's zero available water for the plant. So how do we fix this? Add a bunch of organic matter. Now, sandy soils are essentially the opposite. They generally drain way too fast, and so they are unable to hold on to any nutrients for long enough for a plant to actually use them. Organic matter helps to hold on to water and nutrients, and as with clay, it's almost impossible to add too much. So where clay soils are heavy and they can hold tons of water, because sandy soils are so porous, right? They have large pores, but not necessarily as much pore space as a clay soil. Because of their large pores, that liquid tends to drain right through it really quickly, and it takes nutrients with it because those available nutrients for the plant are water soluble. So it becomes, again, while it's easier to deal with the sandy soil and plants, you can make sort of some intermediate corrections to it by irrigating for shorter durations and more frequently. You can keep up with fertilization, etc. Frequently. So it's easy to actually deal with them. It's still problematic because no matter which way you cut it, you're still driving nutrients down below the root zone where the plants need them. Now, how do we correct this? How do we get sandy soil to be able to hold on to more water? Well, add a bunch of organic matter because organic matter holds water. Okay, so sandy soils drain too fast, whereas clay soils are compact and drain very slowly. Clay soils hold lots of water, drain very slowly, and are compact. Sandy soils cannot hold on to lots of water and drain too fast. Silt, mid-sized particle, we can kind of consider that it has some of the good characteristics of clay, that water holding ability, and then the good fertility or better draining characteristics like sand. Loamy soils, again, a rich, dark, crumbly soil that will allow drainage but still retain enough moisture to be beneficial. Loam is a good balance of sand, clay, and silt, and some organic matter. You actually don't technically need organic matter in it to be a loamy soil, but they tend to have high organic matter content because typically plants thrive in them. And so whether it's a planted or landscape area or not, or a natural area, in a loamy soil, typically we're going to find lots and lots of plants. So they tend to build up organic matter naturally. Here's a question for you. So if we consider this, we have a bucket or a basket filled up with sand, and representatively, it would be basketballs or watermelon. Silt filled up with something in proportion, softball size or grapefruit size. And then clay in proportion being golf ball size or egg size, right? So we're just looking at proportionately what this really means. Questions for you are, which one has more pore space? And which one can hold more water? Okay, so looking at this, I think we've already answered this question, but in looking at this, it's very deceiving, right? If we didn't already talk about it, usually the answer that I get is, which one has more pore space? Sand. Which one can hold more water? Sand, right? Because the pores are larger, right? The actual pores within this space are way bigger than the softballs and way bigger than the golf balls, okay? But the reality of it is, by volume, the golf balls or the clay has way more pore space, and so it can hold way more water. So answer to both these questions is clay or golf balls eggs, depending on which way you want to look at it, right? Now, the explanation behind it is, within this space, the aggregate volume of pore space within this is much greater than the aggregate volume of pore space within this. And the reason behind it is that every single one of these very large particles is all mineral. There is no pore space within the entire volume of the sand, basketballs, or watermelon, again, however you want to look at it, okay? So based on density, this is just, there's zero pores within this space. Now, that same amount of area in this clay, right? If we circled this, right, that same area, there's tons of pore space throughout that whole area, okay? So answer to both these questions is clay. Now, looking at how does the makeup of the soil particles affect soil characteristics, the primary characteristic that we really look at, of course, we'll get into this, but there's some plants that strongly prefer certain types of soils, okay? There's some plants that prefer low to no organic matter. There's some plants that prefer high organic matter, well-draining soils, okay? So in that case, what you're going to get is a sandy soil with high organic matter in it. There's some plants that prefer clay, not many, but there's some plants that do. The majority of the plants, again, prefer some sort of loam. Now, the characteristics in looking at this is really boils down to the water holding capacity, okay? How many inches of water per foot of soil can that soil hold, okay? So in a 1 foot depth of soil, we have in a sandy soil, in that 1 foot depth, it's capable of holding 0.25 to 0.75 inches of water. You flip down to the opposite end of the spectrum, and it can hold pretty much well over twice that in a clay soil. Okay, so that's the characteristics that we're looking at. How can this, what's the capability of this soil type? And what's its ability to hold water? Okay, now the flip side of that is, what is the infiltration rate? How quickly can you put water down on these soils without that soil saturating and getting runoff? And that table is pretty much opposite. Coarse sand, water holding capacity is very low. Its infiltration rate is very high. It can take tons of water all at once, right? It will drain right through it, and it'll essentially, in a coarse sand soil, it will, depending on what the subsoil is, it'll essentially never saturate and end up with runoff, okay? Clay soils, on the other hand, can take, their infiltration rate is incredibly low because it can hold on to so much water, it can saturate, and then we get runoff. Okay, so those are the characteristics of soil type. So if we know the soil type, we have a really good idea of how much water it's capable of holding. We also have a really good idea of how quickly we can put water down onto that. And that's going to inform our irrigation decisions, which we'll get into when we get into cultural conditions, water. We already talked about this, but here's some definition. I think that I just threw it in on one of the previous lectures, but this is humus, okay? A dark brown or black organic substance made up of decayed plant or animal matter. Humus provides nutrients for plants and increases the ability of soil to retain water, okay? Humus is organic matter. In the landscape world, we use compost in place of humus. Okay, so in a natural environment, you can go and you can find that humic layer. Redwood forest, very deep humic layer. Oak forests are very different. Usually it's a very shallow humic layer or very incredibly well dispersed throughout the entire soil profile. Whereas redwood forests, you end up with a really deep top layer of humus. Okay, again, in the horticulture world, our replacement for, or our version of humus is compost. So we've talked about like the mineral portions of a soil, right? We understand the characteristics that a certain soil textural class will give us in terms of water holding capacities, nutrient holding capacity, and its potential infiltration rates, how quickly it can drain water. And we've talked a little bit about those that organic matter within it. Okay, now soil is a living thing. We want a healthy living soil. So this is a different definition than what we had before, which was, sorry, I'm zipping back here. Our definition was the upper layer of earth, which grows plants, right? And it's got some organic remains, clay, and rock particles, okay? This is like the textbook Google Dictionary version. Now let's zip down and let's put a little bit more thought into our soils. And it's a really important piece of what we do, understanding soils, working with soils, and ultimately feeding soil. So this is a much different definition. Soil is a complex dynamic combination of minerals, which we talked about, air and water, we talked about that, and organic matter. Complex dynamic combination. The pieces that like a lot of times people don't think of is 1 teaspoon of a healthy soil can contain billions of beneficial bacteria and fungi. Now, those beneficial bacteria and fungi help us to build and create soil structure. Okay, remember, we cannot change our soil textural class. Okay, that's given to us, but we can improve our soil structure, which is very important. A heavy clay soil with terrible structure is a very difficult media or soil to grow plants in. if we have a heavy clay soil with really good soil structure, with healthy, beneficial bacteria, fungi, and a soil food web within it, that can actually be a really great soil to work in, okay? But it needs structure. A healthy living soil is teeming with these bacteria, fungi, protozoa, beneficial nematodes, worms, and other beneficial organisms that are creating soil structure, storing and cycling nutrients. Remember when we talked about nutrients, there's bacteria in soils and sometimes even in roots that are capable of converting air nitrogen into plant available nitrogen. That is cycling nutrients. Okay, they can store and cycle nutrients. If you have beneficial bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, worms, etc., generally they will protect plants from pests because there's a balance within the soil. As soon as you take it out of balance, problematic pests can impact what you're growing. If you have a well-balanced, healthy living soil, generally those problems take care of themselves. Yes, there's going to be some root knot nematodes in there, but there's beneficial nematodes in there as well that end up eating those. Okay, they prey on them. You get improved infiltration of water and storage of water. Remember, improved infiltration in a clay soil with a good structure. In a sandy soil, you get higher water storage capacities. And with all of these things, especially the fungi, you get the ability to filter out urban pollutants. Fungi and some bacteria have enzymes that will break down urban pollutants. So if you consider like the urban environment, it is a high percentage of impervious surfaces. On those impervious surfaces, when I say impervious surfaces, I'm talking about roofs, driveways, sidewalks, parking lots, roads, etc. Those, by the nature of their material, they do not take water on, they shed water off. Along with that shedding, you also get urban pollutants, heavy metals that are floating in the air, oil dropped on the ground, etc., right? That rain event happens, that those pollutants go soluble in that water and they flow to, sometimes they flow straight to the storm drain and then eventually into our waterways, which are so important to our region, polluting our waterways. If we can get that water instead to flow through or across and through a landscaped area with a healthy living soil, we can filter out those urban pollutants before that water reaches our waterways. And therefore, we're keeping our waterways cleaner by having healthy living soils. So that soil food web that I was talking about, it's a community of organisms living all or part of their lives in the soil. A food web diagram shows a series of conversions of energy and nutrients as one organism eats another. So essentially, I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but to look at this, you can see all of those elements that are involved with a healthy soil, okay? And it's a soil food web, and we need all of these things. We have organic matter, that's waste and residues from plants, animals, and microbes, right? Humus, or our version is compost. You have plants that are part of that soil food web. The roots and shoots are part of that. We have bacteria and fungi, okay, that help to break down that organic matter. We have nematodes that actually feed on roots. We have some insects that will rip, tear and shred those roots apart. Where's our worm on this? We got a worm over here. Anyways, our worms actually come up and they will eat organic matter, humus, whatever it is, and they will partially digest. They'll go back down into the soil. They'll partially digest it. and then they will poop it out, and then bacteria and fungi will break it down even further. And that's driving organic matter down into the ground. So all of these work together, including birds and animals, right? They're all part of this. And if we have all of these things in a soil profile, generally we have a pretty good soil food web, and it's going to be doing all of these things. The soil food web is an integral part of the landscape process. Soil organisms decompose, sequester, enhance, and prey. Okay, so a healthy soil food web is a balanced system. So it's not just dirt that we're looking at, right? We're looking at mineral particles, air, water, and organic matter. And if I zip back to that pie chart, remember that organic matter is broken down into humus, roots, and biological life. That biological life and the roots, and I guess the roots are part of that biological life, those are alive, make up that soil food web, and we need that balance. The organisms of the soil food web are not uniformly distributed through the soil. Each species and group exists where they can find appropriate space, nutrients, and moisture. They occur wherever organic matter occurs, mostly in the top few inches of the soil, including around the roots, in leaf and plant litter, on humus, on the surface of soil aggregates, and in spaces between soil aggregates. Pie chart again for some review and to put this back together, and also to kind of set us up for the next piece that we're going to go through. On the surface of soil aggregates, in spaces between soil aggregates. Now, we need the organic matter, humus, because that's part of the food for the organisms, right? They also need air and water. So these healthy living soils, right? If we have a soil as opposed to dirt, right? If we just have mineral content and that's it. When water hits dirt or only mineral content with no soil food web, no organic matter, nutrients move with the water. Water is not held in the soil pores, and it moves rapidly through the soil. We get leaching, erosion, runoff, and there's no cleaning process. So remember the urban pollutant filtration, that doesn't happen if you only have mineral content. If you have a soil that has mineral content, air, water, organic matter, and a healthy soil food web, then you get organisms in there that build structure. The nutrients are held within that soil profile for the plants to utilize, and water is generally retained and moves through slowly, filtering out any of those pollutants. The result is clean water coming out the bottom end. Healthy living soils improve water mobility, nutrient immobilization, so less leaching, water storage and water quality. Plant fertility improves and builds soil structure, provides soil aeration, improves our transplant survival. So that means when we plant plants, we get a higher survival rate. Improves drought tolerance, primarily because of its water benefits. And with that, you get good root and biological movement. So when we're talking about soil structure, okay, there's a lot of different types of soil structure. We see some examples: crumbly soil structure, platy soil structure, prismatic soil structures, single grain soil structures, blocky and massive. Typically, we're finding blocky and massive soil structures a little bit deeper in the soil profile. Sometimes we see prismatic deeper in the soil profile, although sometimes we see it really high in the soil profile, especially in high clay content soils that tend to saturate in the winter time and completely dry out in the summertime. And the result is those cracks that you can see, right? You can walk through areas that are high clay content in the summertime when all the soil moisture has been depleted. And those soils will essentially shrink away from each other and create this prismatic soil structure. We sometimes see single grain soil structure. Example would be the beach, right? That one's an easy one. A lot of times we see what we see as platy soil structure, and this is inherent. This happens a lot in either areas that flood constantly or in areas that are compacted or in areas that are constantly saturated quickly. Okay, and you end up with a platy soil structure. This isn't a good soil structure for plants to thrive in because those roots keep hitting different density layers, and so it makes it difficult, and they have to spend a lot of energy to be able to try to break through those density layers. Crumbly soil is really what we're looking at. We're looking for really good aggregation of soil, okay? And these are essentially soil aggregates. Now, the way I always try to explain how you can recognize, I'm sure that you've seen a crumbly soil structure. Now, generally, like where you see it in nature is if you're walking through a meadow in spring and there's really high mole, vole, or gopher activity. Those mounds that come out of their holes, and I'm no like expert in it. I know that you can identify, if you look at the mound, you can identify what kind of animal it is. I can't do that, but I do see the mounds. Those mounds are typically crumbly soils, right? It's a mound of crumbly soil. You're not going to see like blocky pieces coming out of there. Generally not single grain pieces either. And that's primarily because it's really hard for them to dig in a really sandy soil. Without their tunnels essentially caving in, right? So you go out there and where you see really high subterranean mammal activity is generally in crumbly soils. One good thing, this is just a little tidbit for you. The soil web for iPhone, I know they have for Android as well. There's been so many soils analyses that have happened throughout the years that they sort of just put a database together. So if you download this app, wherever you are, you open it and you can see what type of soil you're actually on, which is kind of cool. Just remember that hopefully they've updated at this point, but it used to be that you could, if you're out on a site, you could see what kind of soil you're on, but you go back to the office to like write things down and it's going to recognize the soil that you're on because it's GPS located or whatever. Anyways, good to take a screenshot and note which one it was. So this is just a little handy tidbit for you. Now, looking at the soil structure, we've already gone through some of this stuff, so I won't reiterate, but I do want to go into that soil structure building by our soil food web. Okay, and this is a really important thing to understand. Soil structure is considered the arrangement of soil particles into aggregates. Remember back here, we were talking about aggregation. So that arrangement of soil particles into aggregates, and this would be considered an aggregate right here. This is an aggregate. And within that aggregate, we have some soil minerals and organic matter and water, as well as some pore space that has air in it. Now, if we dive into one of these, what we're going to see is we have a soil aggregate that has a couple different sizes of mineral particles that are bound together by organic matter and water, and there's some airspace in there. What this does is it provides a perfect habitat for our microcolonies of microcolonies of bacteria. And those beneficial bacteria are aerobic bacteria, bacteria that need air in order to survive. So they need a place to live, they need air, and they need water. They feed on organic matter. So adding organic matter to your soils helps to feed our soil food web, right? That's one of the primary food sources of the soil food web. Those are primarily soft-bodied animals, bacteria, worms, nematodes, right? These are soft, primarily fungi, right? Fungi is not an animal, but they're all soft-bodied. And those soft-bodied, that soft-bodied bacterial life needs air and water, okay? Now, if you think about soft-bodied biological life, think about what happens when you dump salt on that type of biological life, right? Essentially, it ends up killing that soil food web. And what are fertilizers? Fertilizers are essentially soluble salts. So if we're relying heavily on fertilizers to feed our plants, at the same time, we're inhibiting the ability of the soil food web to provide food for the plants. So instead of focusing on feeding the plant with fertilizers, focus on feeding the soil, which in turn feeds the plant. This is a good one. Let's jump on this real quick. Close that. Let me jump into this. Let's allow that. There we go. So this is an example of really looking at this. And this is actually started my career working at a landscape firm right about here. And I spent a lot of time on Highway 17 to 85 for about 7 years. I lived in South San Jose. So this is the way I would get home. And I spent a lot of time looking at this area. Now, looking at this is Highway 85 at kind of Campbell, San Jose, Los Gatos area. They built Highway 85 in the mid-90s, I think. This picture was taken in May of 2023. Now, in order to build Highway 85, they had to purchase a lot of land through here. And the way that they did it so that they could mitigate the amount of noise that this highway makes is they dug it down into the ground, right? And they had a lot of, intersecting streets and highways, et cetera. So what they did was they dug this down. So this is dug down into the soil profile. And what I like to point out about this is essentially dug down into the soil profile below the topsoil. Okay, so below where any biological life had ever thrived. Then they planted into it. Now, these are redwoods. Again, May 2023 is when this picture was taken. This was dug down and planted in the mid-90s. So we're talking about 25 years, about almost 30 years, 25 to 30 years of growth. Now, some areas of the country, redwoods don't grow that well, but, just beyond this, if we look up into the mountains, Santa Cruz Mountains, which are back here, there's redwoods there. So it's not too far off from their natural environment. The reason that it looks like a Christmas tree farm as opposed to 30-year-old old growth or moderately old growth redwoods is because they were planted into dead soil. Okay, they were planted into soil that had never supported life. They were essentially planted into mineral content only. Okay, so this is a result of no soil food web. I always like pointing that one out. Anyways, you can click on that, check it out. Important thing here is protect those topsoils. The better thing that they could have done would have been to, instead of digging all the way down and trying to plant into that, when this was created, they actually messed up on the specification. When this was created, they should have preserved all of the topsoil and stored it somewhere off-site. Then after the excavation should have included digging down at least an extra 12 inches and then bringing that topsoil in. Okay, that's how you deal with this kind of stuff. But they instead missed that in the specification, and this is the result. These are 30-year-old redwood trees, right? So there you have it. So we talked about how it affects water, and that you know, our soil type, how it affects water holding capacities, drainage rates, infiltration rates, etc. We've also talked about the incredible benefits that a healthy soil food web provides, right? Soil aggregation, building soil structure, cycling nutrients, storing nutrients, holding on to more water, etc. So yes, we always want high organic content in our soil. It helps to sort of mitigate the challenges of both our heavy clay soils and our sandy soils. Now, as it relates to plants, it's really important to understand, like, how do plants react in certain soils? Well, many plants that are used widely and over a really long period of time are selected because of their ability to thrive in many different soil conditions. So a lot of times with like plant people, they'll drive through a parking lot or like down a road, and they'll look at it and say, oh, like, and why would they plant Raphiolepis? Which this one right here is Raphiolepis. This one right here is Photinia. This is Agapanthus. This is daylily or Hemerocallis. This is Chondropetalum or Cape reed, or sorry, Cape rush. So a lot of like plant nerds or people that are really into plants were like, like, why plant more Raphiolepis? Well, the reason it's used so often, Raphiolepis, Photinia, Agapanthus, daylilies, and even this is a little bit more modern plant. This one probably heavily came onto the market about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. The reason that these are so widely used, and people have been using the majority of these plants since the 50s, right? We see them constantly repeated in strip mall parking lots, at monuments, like all sorts of places. We see this all the time. The reason that these plants are used so much is because they can take a heavy clay soil, they can take a sandy soil, they can take a loamy soil. So they traverse a lot of different soil textural classes, and they can actually thrive in them. So the next time that you're driving through a strip mall and you see a bunch of Raphiolepis in there, well, instead of thinking, oh, why'd they use that? They should be more creative or whatever it is, think, well, they used it because of the conditions, right? And it's very easy just to repeat Raphiolepis 1,000 times on plans, because there's a pretty good chance that regardless of the soil conditions, it's going to thrive. Now, there's some other plants that really have a hard time in certain types of soils. So if a particular plant prefers a certain soil condition but is forced to endure something else, it will react accordingly. So Ceanothus is really notorious for this. Ceanothus prefers 0 to very little organic matter. It's a soft chaparral plant. Most of them are. There's a lot of different cultivated varieties. There's a lot of different varieties, and a lot of different species of Ceanothus. But generally, they prefer shallow soils that are moderately well draining with very little organic content. So it needs to, at a minimum, be moderately well draining. If you put a Ceanothus in a heavy clay soil and you heavily irrigate it, it will actually show you that it does not like that. And this is actually the result, right? Ceanothus planted in poor draining waterlogged soil, what it'll do is its oldest leaves, it's just going to start trying to get rid of them. So what you'll see is older leaves start yellowing and falling off. You can shake the Ceanothus, they'll all fall off. There'll be some of the smaller leaves. if you experience this, stop watering it. Let that soil dry out, and you'll probably immediately or within a week, you'll start to see some positive results. But if you continue to irrigate it too heavily, then it will end up dying. Okay, you'll end up killing it. Now, another notorious one for the same kind of effect is lavender. Okay, so lavender really prefers a coarse soil. Decomposed granite is great for lavender. Clay is terrible. Now, I'm a huge lavender fan. I really like incorporating lavender into my plans and my planting plans. But if I've got a clay soil, a heavy clay soil, chances are my favorite lavenders to use are not going to work well. And this ends up being the result. Okay. If you've got a soil type that inherently does not drain well, those lavenders may look like this for a season or two. Pretty soon they're going to look like this. Okay, they're essentially just going to start dying out completely, or you'll get big chunks of them slowly dying out. And that's a really good indication that, hey, you got to switch the plant. Remember, we can't change our soil textural class, so we have to honor what that class is. And if we're picking plants in a known soil textural class, don't veer too far from it, because could be a really pretty plan on, on the plan, right? The plan could look great and the plants would look great together, but if they won't survive, it's not going to look good in reality. So honor that soil type. Now, in the landscape, right, if we have existing conditions, again, we can't change our soil textural class, but we can improve the conditions. And typically the approach that we take is adding organic matter to improve the soil food web, to develop a healthy soil structure and get that complex dynamic condition so that it feeds the plants, right? Now, in the rest of horticulture, right, we're growing those plants, right? We've got that landscape area that is designing and selecting the plants, putting those plants in the ground, maintaining those plants long term. So we're looking at soil conditions. Now, how do we deal with that in the rest of the horticultural world? Well, the rest of the horticultural world is primarily involved with growing plants. And again, whether that is for house plants or retail wholesale nurseries or food or whatever it is, what we do is we use a growing media or growing medium, okay? A growing medium can be defined as a substance through which plants grow and extract water and nutrients, right? So for the period of time that we have them in those pots, whether that's permanently or temporarily, we need those plants to grow and root into it and be able to extract water and nutrients. Selecting a good growing medium is fundamental to good nursery management and is the foundation of a healthy root system. We want a very healthy root system before it's sent off to its final location. Growing media is what plants' roots grow in. It supports the plants in that pot. It has a reservoir of nutrients. It has to have a reservoir of air. Remember, we need aerobic conditions. We need oxygen. And it has a reservoir of water for those roots to take up. If it's in a container, we call it container media. If it is soilless, it is soilless. So there isn't any field soil in it. There's no mineral content in it, right? There's none of the quartz, etc. Okay, so it doesn't have that in it. It is, there's no true field soil in it. This is the reason. Field soil holds too much water to be used. Get my spotlight back on. Field soil holds too much water to be used in a container. Characteristics of a good media is that it holds water well. It's well aerated, so it holds air as well. It drains. It holds nutrients, can release those nutrients readily. It's lightweight. That's a very important piece for shipping. And it's stable. That means it breaks down very slowly. Okay, so if we're looking at characteristics of a good growing media or container media, it should hold water, have air, have nutrients, have the ability to release those nutrients, not be too heavy so that it can be shipped without excessive amounts of costs, and it should be stable so it should not break down slowly. So we're going to go through the organic materials first that we put into these mixes. The primary one that's used is peat moss. It's partially decayed in anaerobic conditions, low oxygen, low to no oxygen. Typically, we find these in bogs in the upper northern hemisphere. Canada, Greenland, there's a lot of peat bogs in those regions. And essentially, there was peat that grew and grew and grew and grew. And then that's essentially decaying, but it's in the absence of oxygen or with very little oxygen. And so it only partially decays. Okay. Now, it's a great growing medium as an organic material. Okay. The organic component of one of the organic ingredients in our growing mediums. So the point or the main primary function of peat or any of the organic materials is that it holds water. Okay. Generally, our organic portions of our growing media they're there to hold water. Just like our organic matter in our soils increases our water holding capacity. Now, it's also interesting to note that peat moss holds moisture, right? It holds moisture really, really well, but it's hydrophobic when it's dry. Okay, so if peat moss completely dries out, it's very hard to wet again. So if you have a pot, and this happens a lot, I know you can get indoor plants at IKEA for really inexpensive. I mean, sometimes I'll swing in there just to see if I can get a good score. But the media that they use is incredibly high in peat moss content. In fact, it's almost 100% peat, which is good and bad. So if you get one of those plants, make sure you repot it with some good growing media. It's good for them because it's lightweight and roots grow into it really well. If you bring it home and you keep it like that, you need to make sure that you keep the moisture content at a reasonable level. As soon as water content goes out of that and you try to pour water on top of it, typically it will repel that moisture. Okay. The way that you get it to bring the moisture back is you need to actually put that pot into a bucket of water and it will slowly absorb that. So when we're using peat moss in our growing media, typically the way that you do it is you want to take a whole bale of peat moss and put it into a large trash container, basically a very large container. Fill that up completely with water, and then that peat moss will slowly absorb that water. Once it has water in it, it's fine. It holds that water really well. As soon as that water is completely depleted, it becomes hydrophobic. And actually, compost acts the same way. Compost holds water really well, but if it's 100% dry, then it repels water. Literally, you can pour water on it, it will bead and roll right off. So peat moss is one of the main or most popular organic materials to put into growing medias. So peat moss, also reed peat, same process, but it just has a different parent material. Sedge peat, same thing. It's just same process, but instead of it being peat, it's actually carex. It's a sedge. Sphagnum peat, so that's from a sphagnum moss, same thing. It's just not peat. It's just where this actually comes from. Now there is sphagnum moss out there. Don't confuse sphagnum moss. Let's see if we get, yeah. So this right here is sphagnum moss. Don't confuse sphagnum moss with a organic media material. Okay. What sphagnum moss is really, it's generally used in the horticultural industry to line wire baskets or for some other things. Okay, but it's not really like a soil amendment or a growing or container media ingredient. Okay, so you don't necessarily want to use that. But these are the organic peats. Okay, or yeah, these are the organic peats. So now it's important to recognize that of these here, none of these are renewable resources. It takes ages to develop a peat bog or a sphagnum bog or a carex bog. Okay, it takes a really, really long time. And as it's harvested at a rate that is higher than it's replenished. So it is not a renewable resource, and it's not a product that we're using as one of the ingredients in our growing media that is a sustainable one. Okay, it's used a lot, it's inexpensive, it does a great job, but it's not renewable and it's not a byproduct of another industry. Here is milled sphagnum peat moss, reed peat, sedge peat, and here's that sphagnum moss. It's used to line baskets in horticulture. Now, other types of organic matter used in medias can be compost. Okay, some growers will use compost. It can be screened fir bark, or for orchid growing media. A lot of times much larger, coarser bark is used. This is a screened fir bark here. This is a compost. This is a finely shredded bark is what it looks like, I think, or maybe it's just wood chips. This is coconut coir. So these here, the compost, fir bark, larger fir bark, and coconut coir, all these are either, these last three are all from a byproduct of another industry. So fir bark comes from the lumber and paper industry. They don't use bark in the lumber and they don't use bark in the paper. So they strip the bark off and it can be used as a growing media. That is a byproduct. So it's a better product from like a sustainability or regenerative standpoint than the peats. Compost, of course, we're constantly making compost, always making compost. It's readily available. There's almost too much compost. There's never too much compost, but compost is essentially the byproduct of the recycling industry, right? They're making that, they've got to make it, otherwise it's going to the landfill, which there's a bunch of problems with that. Coconut coir is the byproduct of the coconut industry, right? So if we're looking at all of these, the peats primarily all come from a kind of a distant, like, so there's high transportation with peats and it's not a renewable resource. Compost generally comes from close by. There's composting facilities all over the place. Barks come from moderately greater distances, right? It's some forest in the Northern Sierra or wherever, right? It's coming out of somewhere, but it's relatively close by. Coconut coir is used frequently. It's actually a great product for a lot of different uses in, you know, beyond growing media. But coconut, it's great because it's a byproduct of another industry. The downside to it is that it comes from pretty far away, right? There's no coconut plants in San Francisco or anything, right? So these are getting shipped across seas. So of these organic matters, materials that are used in growing medias, these ones are used frequently. Everybody's used to using them. I'm not saying we shouldn't use them. I just want you guys to understand what the pros and cons of each one are, right? And every grower comes up with their own mix. Of course, there's certain mixes that a lot of people use, but to really develop like your growing media, you're constantly tweaking and trying new things too. These here are all from more renewable resources or are byproducts of another industry. Okay. Again, our organic components, generally they are hydrophobic, but once they're wet, they hold water really well. And that's the primary thing. That's the primary function of the organic ingredients in a growing media, is to hold water. Now, we also have inorganic components. These include perlite, vermiculite, grit, pumices, sands, etc., and lava rock. Okay, so these are inorganic components. These are mineral components. Now, I guess this is like a substitute, a controlled substitute of our mineral content in our soils. Our mineral content in our soils, what we're trying to get out of them, or what those characteristics are water holding capacities as well as aeration. So we use inorganic components, and these are primarily mineral-based components that we're putting them in to improve our drainage and improve our porosity. So it's making sure that there's still air and that water drains through. That's what we use these in our growing media for. So perlite is often used. Vermiculite, same thing. Pumice, lava rock are kind of the primaries. So perlite is mined and heated to 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, which expands it up to 13 times. Okay, comes in a lot of different sizes. Generally, in a good container media, we're using a medium course. It increases pore space in media and drainage. The nice thing about perlite is it is a very neutral pH. Okay, and it contains fluorides. It contains some stuff that's beneficial. Now, vermiculite, on the other hand, is mined mica, and it's also heated up, which makes it accordion-like in structure. It holds more water than perlite. So perlite increases our pore space. Vermiculite increases pore space, but it also has the benefit of being able to hold water. The structure of it does collapse over time. Generally, though, these plants, if there's vermiculite involved, they're not going to be in that pot for too long. Grit, pumice, or larger sand is always washed clean, so there's no salt. And the point of it is it's sized to create larger pores, which improves our drainage and aeration in our growing media. Lava rock, same thing. It increases pore space. So the primary function of our inorganic components is increasing our pore space and improving our drainage, whereas our inorganic materials primarily are used to be able to hold on to water. So here's perlite. Essentially, we take, there's volcanic rocks that are crushed down and then expanded, and you can have coarse, medium, and fine perlites. Here's pumice. Pumice is used in whole form. Pumice is used in whole form and has very similar characteristics and qualities that perlite has. The downside to pumice over perlite is that it's much heavier than perlite. A little bit more expensive too because of that. Lava rock does the same thing, used in whole form. It does not go through a manufacturing process. Perlite, manufactured. Pumice, no manufactured, reused in whole form. Lava rock, used in whole form. Vermiculite, manufactured. It has to go through a manufacturing process. In that process, we're heating things up. we get carbon dioxide, we get carbon emissions through that. Okay, so I'm not trash talking any of these ingredients. I do think it's important that you have to consider, okay, here's an ideal world of very low carbon footprint, but we also have to be profitable, and vermiculite and perlite are less expensive, lighter, certainly lighter than lava rock and lighter than pumice. Okay, but again, perlite and vermiculite go through a manufacturing process. Pumice and lava rock are used in whole form. Here's some builder's sand. Typically, we're using some sand. I know that you don't use any field soil, but you can use sand in it. A lot of times you're using sand in mixes that the plants require excellent drainage. So low water use or drought tolerant plants and succulents and cactus, usually there's a good amount of sand in those mixes. So here's some info on what these ingredients do for the mix and certain combinations or things you want to think about for certain things that you may be growing. So if you're starting seeds, you want to use very small particle sizes. Okay, why? Because the initial roots coming off of a seedling are incredibly delicate. And if they've got to work their way through big chunks of pumice and lava rock and stuff, it's going to take them a while to be able to start to develop those roots, right? So seedlings, or seed starts, we want to start with small particle sizes. So if we're going to be incorporating some perlite in, we'd probably be using the finer perlite. If we're growing plants that need good drainage, like drought tolerant plants, succulents, cactuses, we want higher organic matter. We want to increase higher inorganic content because there's better porosity and better drainage. If you're growing plants that need lots of water, then you want higher organic matter because the characteristic of the organic matter is higher water holding capacities. It holds onto that water. Okay? So if you're working with a plant if you're growing plants that are high water use plants, you're going to have a mix that is higher in the organic matters. With plants that are planned to get planted in a landscape that are grown in 6-inch pots or larger, you don't want to use perlite in those mixes. Now, the reason for that is that if you're planting a bunch of plants into the landscape that have growing media on them that has a lot of perlite, that perlite is so light that it literally will just get blown away. And the other problem with it that I've found is that, like, if you plant a bunch of ground cover with high perlite content, what ends up happening is literally crows primarily, lots of birds and rodents will go down and they think it's food. And so they'll start trying to grab it and they end up pulling up all your plants in the process. So if you're growing plants that are planned for the landscape in 6-inch pots or larger, minimize or eliminate the perlite, use something else. Use pumice or lava rock. Problem with lava rock is it's heavier than pumice, and vermiculite. But the perlite, keep it out of the mix because it will fly everywhere and be a problem. Small containers, so 4-inch pots and smaller, usually you're using like a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2 organic to inorganic ratio. If it's cutting media, okay, so if you're taking cuttings, if you're cloning plants, generally you want a lower organic. You need organic in there to hold water, but you want higher proportions of inorganic so that there's no opportunity for standing water, okay? Essentially, you want to be able to keep it wet and allow those roots to develop off of that node, off of the cutting, but you don't want really wet conditions, like saturated conditions. And the way that you achieve that is lower organic content, so 1 to 3 organic to inorganic or totally inorganic. So 1 to 3 to 1 to 9 or completely inorganic. And you need to irrigate those frequently. You need to keep it wet, but you can't have built up moisture or opportunity for fungus. Okay. Now, larger landscape plants, generally you're going a higher organic content to inorganic content. And this is one of the primary reasons, right? You don't want a bunch of pumice and lava rock interacting with that field soil. You want something that is closer in representation to a field soil. And so you go with at least a 4 to 1 organic to inorganic. This makes it also so that you have to irrigate less often, which reduce your costs in that growing environment. So making media. When you're making the media, there's some tricks to it. It's better to moisten the media when you're making it to keep the dust down. So when you're working with perlite and pumice, a lot of times there's some dust involved. Making sure that it's wet is important. Moisten the media before putting it into the containers. So like if you are transplanting some 4-inch pots into 5-gallon pots or whatever it is, make sure that that media is moist before you put it in the container, because remember, if it dries out, it's hydrophobic, so it's hard to get moist again. And if you put a root ball into really dry media, chances of that moisture wicking out is high, but there's not enough moisture to fill that whole container. So you could have some transplant problems. Now, this moistened media, when you're making it, is important to keep the dust down. But remember, a couple slides ago, I talked about the peat mosses, so those organic portions of the growing media materials. We want to wet those beforehand. Right? So essentially, like, you'd want to wet that the night before, allow it to completely absorb all that water. It also makes breaking down that material much easier, because it generally comes in like compact bales and you need to break all of that up. You can spend time out there whacking it with a shovel, but it's a lot easier if you just fill up a huge trash can with water, dump the peat bale in there, let it do its thing overnight, and then it's completely broken up, and then wet down the inorganics, and then mix it up, and then wet it as you're doing it, and then utilize it. So here's some basic recipes for you. This is always, like, for me, this is just handy for you to be able to consider and think about. And then tweak them as you see fit. So a basic mix is typically 4 to 6 parts peat moss or coir, 1 part perlite, 1 part vermiculite. And then a different one may be 2 parts compost, 2 to 4 parts peat or coir, 1 part perlite, 1 part vermiculite. And you can see, like, the different mixes in here. Essentially, we're at 4 to 6 parts organic to 2 parts inorganic. Okay, same thing here. We're at 4 to 6 parts organic to 2 parts inorganic. And this is just a basic mix for all general growing mediums. Of course, if we zip on back to this, we know that there's some really specific things that we may want to consider given the plants that we may be growing out. Okay, so just some little tidbits for you, nothing major that I'm going to heavily quiz you on. And then if you do want to add nutrients, bone meal, oyster shell, blood meal, I prefer to encourage all of these things because it's better for the soil. Okay, it's better for that plant. Okay, so that's it on cultural requirements of plants, this one being soil, and then we dove directly into how do we deal with this in the horticultural industry. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you on the next one.